Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's explainer, where we are going to unpack what is honestly one of the most baffling, impossible sounding aviation mysteries in human history. I mean, just imagine this. A commercial flight takes off, completely disappears into thin air without a single trace, and then somehow, against all logic, returns to the world almost a decade later. I know, it sounds exactly like a sci-fi movie, but today we're walking through the very real documented story of Flight NC 16002. So, to really understand this, we have to set the scene. We're going all the way back to a freezing cold December night in 1948. Flight NC 16002 was scheduled for what should have been a completely routine, boring journey across the Atlantic. The weather was standard, the crew was fully prepared, and there was absolutely zero indication that this flight was about to become the stuff of legends. There were 134 souls on board that night. That's 125 passengers and 9 crew members, all completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. And for the first few hours, everything was totally normal. The aircraft was just cruising smoothly through the pitch-black sky at over 8,000 feet, and Captain Robert Miller was just casually chatting with air traffic control. But then, right at 8:13 p.m., everything shifted. Out of nowhere, the radio signal just weakens. Captain Miller comes on the radio sounding calm and reports a minor technical issue. But you guys, those were literally the last words anyone ever heard from Flight NC 1602. Just seconds later, boom, the aircraft completely vanished from radar. And its last known location, right smack in the middle of one of the most mysterious places on Earth, the Bermuda Triangle. Now, as you can imagine, search teams immediately launched this massive, all-hands-on-deck rescue operation. We're talking planes scouring the skies, ships grid-searching the ocean surface. But there was one huge, glaring problem. They found absolutely nothing. No wreckage, no distress signal, no survivors, just nothing. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, Flight NC 1602 had simply ceased to exist. Section 1. The uncharted island crash. Because the truth of what was actually happening to those 134 people was so much stranger than anyone staring at an empty radar screen could have ever guessed. According to the incredible story that eventually came to light, the aircraft had actually flown directly into this violent, completely unexplained storm. I mean, it was unlike anything this highly experienced crew had ever seen. The power systems failed instantly. The navigation instruments just went totally dark. The compass was spinning wildly out of control. And for 30 agonizing minutes, passengers were screaming as this massive airplane was tossed around the sky like a little plastic toy, fighting against these incredible forces that literally no one could explain. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the storm broke. But right in front of them was land, an island that was on absolutely zero maps. With engines failing and their altitude dropping way too fast, Captain Miller knew he had literally no choice but to try an emergency landing. So he aims for the island and the aircraft crashes directly into the thick canopy of this massive ancient tree. And miraculously, truly miraculously, those dense branches acted like a giant cushion and absorbed a ton of the impact. Defying every mathematical odd out there, the majority of the passengers actually survived that initial crash. Section 2. 9 years of isolation. Because, as it turns out, surviving the actual plane crash, that was just the prologue to their nightmare. See, this island was entirely cut off from the rest of the planet. No buildings, no roads, absolutely no way to call for help. And it didn't take long for the survivors to realize they only had a tiny amount of salvaged food and water. Now, a retired Army doctor who happened to be on board, a woman named Evelyn Reed, jumped right in and started treating the wounded, while Captain Miller did his best to organize everyone. But days quickly turned into weeks. Food was desperately scarce. Tragic things happened, like one passenger dying just from eating a toxic, unknown fruit. People were really starting to lose hope. But then, a teenage boy managed to start a fire using just the thick lens of his glasses. And let me tell you, that single fragile little flame, it became their absolute beacon of survival. Meanwhile, an engineer from the passenger cabin, Arthur Vance, was spending every waking hour trying to fix the plane's smashed-up radio. And by some miracle, he actually strung together enough parts to send out a super weak distress signal. So they waited. They prayed for a response, but nothing came. Nobody heard it. And then the battery died. Just like that, their absolute last tether to the outside world was severed. So, months drifted by. And those months eventually turned into years. The group just had to adapt. They built these incredibly sturdy shelters out of chunks of airplane fuselage. They figured out how to fish the local waters, how to hunt wild animals, and they even started cultivating their own crops. Honestly, the wildest part? Children were born on this island. For those kids, this bizarre, completely isolated patch of jungle was literally the entire universe. It's really jarring when you compare it to what was happening back home. Back in America, the search had been officially called off ages ago. The government declared every single person on flight NC-16002 legally dead. Funerals were held, families grieved, and slowly, painfully, the world moved on. But out on that island, those survivors absolutely refused to throw in the towel. It was brutal, of course. Tropical diseases, freak accidents, and a few desperate failed escape attempts claimed a lot of lives. The group was shrinking year by year, but they kept pushing forward.
9. I really want us to just sit with that number for a second. 9 full years. Can you imagine? Almost a decade of waking up every single morning, looking out at the horizon, and wondering if the rest of humanity had just completely forgotten about you. 9 years of battling the jungle, sickness, and total despair.
Section 3. The impossible radio signal. Right when it felt like they were going to be permanently swallowed by history, a massive natural disaster changed everything. So nearly a decade into this ordeal, a massive earthquake violently rocks the island. The ground shakes so hard that it actually shifts heavy pieces of the original wreckage that hadn't moved in years. And while he's inspecting this newly shifted debris, Arthur Vance, the engineer who tried so hard to fix the radio way back at the beginning, he spots some exposed wiring, and it's still connected to the old radio system. So, acting on pure, desperate instinct, he just flips a switch. And out of nowhere, a faint crackling sound fills the air. The radio was alive. Hands totally shaking, Arthur patches in what's left of their makeshift power system, and this tiny, beautiful green light flickers on. For the first time in 9 years, they had a voice again. Arthur grabs the mic and says, "Mayday, Mayday. This is flight NC-16002. If anyone can hear this, we're alive." Now picture this. Thousands of miles away, some air traffic controller hears this transmission and literally freezes in his chair. Initially, he thinks it's a horrible prank. I mean, you would too, right? But then Arthur starts rattling off these highly specific, classified details about the flight that only someone actually on that plane could possibly know. It was real. The impossible was happening. A flight that vanished into the Bermuda Triangle nearly 10 years ago was calling for help. Section 4. Rescue and Resilience. And you better believe that radio transmission kicked off one of the most frantic, explosive rescue operations in modern history. They launched a mission without a single second's delay. Days later, a U.S. Navy ship is out there scanning the exact coordinates they triangulated from Arthur's radio ping. And suddenly, a lookout spots it. A thin, little column of smoke rising up from this tiny, uncharted island. It was the exact same spot they had crashed into, and they were using the exact same fire-starting technique that teenager had figured out almost a decade prior. As that massive Navy vessel finally pulled up to the shore, the survivors just came pouring out of the jungle. They were sprinting across the beach, waving their arms, absolutely screaming. A lot of them just collapsed right there in the sand, sobbing. Some were laughing like crazy, and others were just staring at this metal ship in complete and utter shock. The isolation was over. Rescue was real. And when the news broke, the entire world was floored. These passengers, the ones everybody thought were sitting at the bottom of the ocean, were standing right there in front of the cameras. They were painfully thin, they were deeply exhausted, and they were changed forever. Their story instantly became this global symbol of sheer human resilience. It is the ultimate proof that even in the absolute darkest, most cut-off situations you can possibly imagine, humans can still find a way to survive. So as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. If a vanished flight can return from the darkness after nearly a decade, how long can hope truly endure? It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? As long as that tiny spark of hope remains, the fight is never, ever truly over. Thanks so much for joining me today. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.